The cold Atlantic wind cut across the tarmac at Dow Field in Bangor, Maine, as 10 young men stood beneath the shimmering aluminum wings of a brand-new Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress. Captain Robert K. Morgan, a lanky pilot from Asheville, North Carolina, reached out and traced his fingers along the fuselage of serial number 41-24485, feeling each rivet beneath his touch. The aircraft had rolled off the assembly line and been added to the Army Air Force's inventory on July 15, 1942, arriving at the 91st Bombardment Group just 2 months later in September. None of these men could have imagined that they were standing at the threshold of history, that they would soon become part of the most storied bomber crew in American aviation, earning their place not through cinema magic, but through sheer determination against mathematical odds that seemed designed to crush them. The plan was straightforward enough. Morgan and his crew would ferry their B-17 across the Atlantic to England, where they'd join the 324th Bombardment Squadron of the 91st Bombardment Group at RAF Bassingbourn. But Morgan had made a promise to his men first. He ordered a detour south to Tennessee, to a city that would forever change the identity of their aircraft. In Memphis, Morgan stood before the bomber with spray paint in hand and christened it after his girlfriend, Margaret Polk. He'd originally wanted to name it after his pet name for her, but fate intervened. After watching a film that featured a riverboat called the Memphis Belle, the name crystallized in his mind. Young Margaret Polk, thousands of miles away in America, had become an unwitting legend. Her image soon to be painted across the nose of a bomber destined to face the furnace of German airspace. The Memphis Belle touched down at Prestwick, Scotland, on September 30, 1942, then moved to a temporary base at RAF Kimballton on October 1st. By October 14th, she had reached her permanent home at RAF Bassingbourn in England, nestled in the countryside north of London in Cambridgeshire. This peaceful English village would be their base for the next 7 months. Though what awaited them there would test every ounce of courage these young men possessed. The numbers haunted everyone who knew them. When the United States began flying bombing missions from English bases over occupied Europe, the losses climbed to a staggering 82%. Years later, Morgan would describe the horror of those statistics in stark, unforgettable terms. An 82% loss rate meant breakfast with 10 men and dinner with just 2. The War Department had set a threshold. Crews had to complete a certain number of missions before they could rotate home. But in late 1942 and early 1943, when that number was 25 missions, the mathematics seemed almost impossible. Only 35% of the men who flew those initial bombing tours survived. On November 7, 1942, the Memphis Belle crew strapped into their aircraft and lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness. Their target was the submarine pens at Brest, France. They climbed skyward as part of a formation of B-17s headed toward the English Channel, toward occupied Europe, toward combat. The men had logged hundreds of training hours, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what was waiting. The Army Air Forces had entered the war with a bold doctrine developed at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama: daylight precision bombing. The theory was elegant. Fly in tight formations during daylight hours, and you could hit targets with accuracy. The problem was catastrophic. There were no long-range escort fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfires that accompanied them could only fly so far, just to the western edge of Germany, and then they had to turn back. Once those fighters peeled away and headed home, the bombers were utterly alone, vulnerable to anything the German Luftwaffe could throw at them. The British had warned this would be suicide. They were right. On November 9th, just 2 days after their first mission, the Memphis Belle flew again, this time to St. Nazaire. Then on November 17th, they were back in the air. The American bomb groups were being sent against the toughest targets the Luftwaffe could defend: submarine pens at Brest and St. Nazaire, docks and shipyards at Wilhelmshaven, rail yards at Rouen, aircraft factories at Antwerp. The German U-boat pens were engineering marvels, massive concrete bunkers designed to withstand any bombing assault, yet they seemed nearly indestructible to conventional attack. Still, the 8th Air Force kept sending bombers against them, mission after mission, loss after loss. Winter descended on England in December, but the operations never stopped. On December 6th, they hit the locomotive works at Lille, France. On December 20th, they struck the airfield at Romilly-sur-Seine. Every mission was a gamble with fate. Every time the Memphis Belle touched down at Bassingbourg, the crew would count the empty hard stands on the flight line, places where other B-17s had taken off that morning and would never return. The Memphis Belle herself was a walking testament to punishment and survival. Her engines had been shot out 5 separate times. Her tail had nearly been severed by cannon fire. She was riddled with bullet holes, riddled with shrapnel damage, yet her crew had not sustained a single major injury. That alone seemed to defy every law of probability and chance. January 1943 brought no relief. On January 3rd, they flew back over Saint-Nazaire. January 13th found them heading to Lille again. January 23rd took them deep into France to attack the submarine pens at Lorient. In the freezing sky above that German U-boat base, the Memphis Belle held her position, pressing through German fighter attacks, threading through the violent explosions of anti-aircraft fire, refusing to evade, refusing to break formation. It was late January when everything changed. Major William Wyler arrived at RAF Bassingbourn. Wyler was a filmmaker of considerable reputation, a man who had directed acclaimed pictures like Wuthering Heights and Mrs. Miniver. He had joined the Army Air Forces to document the air war, to capture on film what was happening in the skies over Europe. Morgan recounted in his memoirs that Wyler approached him in late January 1943, just after the crew's 8th mission. Wyler explained that he wanted to film the Memphis Belle and her crew. There was something about that name, something compelling about Morgan's reputation as a pilot. With Morgan and the Memphis Belle, Wyler believed he'd have a chance of surviving to bring his film home. Wyler had originally been following Captain Oscar O'Neill, whose B-17 was nicknamed Invasion 2 with the 401st Bomb Squadron. But fate had other plans. On April 17, 1943, O'Neill's bomber and 5 others were shot down over Bremen, Germany, in what was then the costliest single mission the 8th Air Force had yet experienced. Wyler needed a new subject. Morgan and the Memphis Belle would become his obsession. February 4th brought the crew's 9th mission, this time to Kiel, Germany, their first strike into the German heartland itself. February 14th took them to Ham. Then on February 16th, the Memphis Belle sustained severe battle damage over Saint-Nazaire and had to go into the repair hangars. While ground crews worked to restore her, Wyler's first filmed combat mission wasn't aboard the Memphis Belle at all, but on another B-17, the Jersey Bounce, on February 26, 1943, heading to Wilhelmshaven. The mission drew intense German fighter attacks, and 2 of the 91st Group's bombers were shot down. Despite the danger, Wyler would film at least 6 more combat missions with Morgan's crew, sometimes aboard the Memphis Belle and sometimes aboard other aircraft, with cameras positioned in the nose, tail, waist, and radio compartments. The cost of documenting war was written in lives. First Lieutenant Harold J. Tannenbaum, a veteran of the First World War and one of 3 cinematographers, was killed in action when his bomber was shot down over France on April 16, 1943. Wyler himself suffered frostbite and temporary hearing loss from the intense cold and noise of high-altitude bombing runs. But Morgan's crew pressed on. March saw them strike Lorient on the 6th, Rouen on the 12th and 13th, Wilhelmshaven on the 22nd, and back to Rouen on the 28th. April brought missions to Antwerp on the 5th, Lorient on the 16th, and the brutal Bremen raid on the 17th. May took them to Saint-Nazaire on the 1st and Antwerp on the 4th. By mid-May, they could see the finish line. Several B-17s were racing to complete their combat tours. A B-17F called Delta Rebel No. 2 finished 25 credited combat missions on May 1, 1943, becoming the first B-17 in the European theater to accomplish that feat. Hell's Angels, another B-17F from the 303rd Bombardment Group, completed 25 missions on May 13, 1943. But neither would get a homecoming. The Memphis Belle crew had lost no one, not a single man, which made them the logical choice for a return to the States for a war bond publicity tour. Tragically, Delta Rebel No. 2 would be shot down on August 12, 1943, during a mission to Gelsenkirchen, Germany, with 6 crewmen captured and 4 killed. On May 15th, their 24th mission took them to Wilhelmshaven. One more. Just one more mission stood between them and home. Weiler's cameras were rolling as the Memphis Belle climbed skyward on that penultimate flight. Weiler had confided to Morgan that if the Memphis Belle was shot down on their final mission, he had arranged a backup plan. Another crew flying another B-17, Hell's Angels from the nearby 303rd Bombardment Group, was also on the verge of completing 25 missions. On May 17, 1943, the Memphis Belle flew her 25th and final combat mission. Their target was the massive submarine base at Lorient, France. In 148 hours and 50 minutes of flight time across more than 20,000 combat miles, they had done it. The Memphis Belle's gunners had been credited with shooting down 8 enemy fighters, with 5 more claimed as probable kills and a dozen others damaged. Her crew had dropped more than 60 tons of bombs across France, Germany, and Belgium. They had beaten the odds. Against every calculation, every statistic, every prediction, they had survived. The crew was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and 3 oak leaf clusters each. Only tail gunner Staff Sergeant John P. Quinlan received a Purple Heart, having been officially wounded in combat. On May 18, 1943, King George VI, dressed in the uniform of a Marshal of the Royal Air Force, stood before them with Queen Elizabeth. 10 young Americans, men who had carried the war to Nazi Germany and lived, stood before the monarchs of Britain. The Memphis Belle was flown back to the United States on June 8, 1943, piloted by Captain Morgan himself, alongside a composite crew selected by the 8th Air Force. Morgan's original co-pilot, Captain James Averine, who had flown one mission in the Memphis Belle before being promoted to aircraft commander of another B-17 called Connecticut Yankee, and completing his tour on May 13th, rejoined Morgan as co-pilot for the journey across the Atlantic and home. The young men who completed that historic journey embodied America in microcosm. Their ages spanned just 7 years, from 19 to 26, yet they hailed from across the nation's breadth: Washington, Indiana, Texas, Connecticut, and beyond. Captain Robert K. Morgan piloted the aircraft from his home in Asheville, North Carolina, carrying his 24 years with quiet authority. Alongside him flew Captain James Averines from Woodbridge, Connecticut, while Captain Charles B. Layton navigated from Flint, Michigan. The bombardier, Captain Vincent B. Evans, came from Fort Worth, Texas, bringing his expertise to every sortie. The enlisted crew rounded out this patchwork of American geography. Technical Sergeant Robert J. Hanson manned the radio from Walla Walla, Washington. Technical Sergeant Harold P. Locke, the top turret gunner and engineer, hailed from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Staff Sergeant Cecil H. Scott, operating the ball turret, came from Arapahoe, North Carolina. John P. Quinlan, the tail gunner from Yonkers, New York, held one of the most exposed and vulnerable positions on the bomber. Staff Sergeant Casimir A. Nostal worked as a waist gunner, having come from Detroit, Michigan, while Staff Sergeant Clarence E. Winchell, another waist gunner, originated from Oak Park, Illinois. One crucial absence marked the crew's composition. Staff Sergeant E. Scott Miller, the right waist gunner from Kingwood, West Virginia, had flown 15 demanding missions aboard the Memphis Belle. Yet he remained stateside during the triumphant tour. The reason was simple but poignant. He hadn't yet completed the 25 missions required for rotation. While his crewmates traveled across America, accepting accolades and recognition, Miller continued flying hazardous combat missions over Europe, grinding toward his own liberation from the skies. For decades, his contribution would fade from the historical record, overshadowed by the celebrity that embraced his fellow airmen. Traveling with the crew came an unexpected companion. Stuka, a small Scottish terrier that co-pilot Jim Varenis had purchased from a London pet store. In a war defined by mechanized death and industrial horror, this small dog became a symbol of something irreplaceable: normalcy. The dog's presence on the tour reminded audiences that beneath the uniforms and the machinery, these were young men still capable of affection and humor. The Memphis Belle visited more than 32 American cities, and at each stop, the reception proved overwhelming. Washington, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Wichita, and Mobile all rolled out their welcomes. Bond rallies unfolded across the country, yet this tour carried weight that movie stars could never match. These men didn't represent manufactured glamour. They represented survival against impossible odds. They had stared death in the face repeatedly and lived to tell about it. In Asheville, Morgan's own hometown, the tour concluded with particular emotion. The City Fathers arranged a grand reception and party at the City Hall auditorium. Each crew member spoke to the assembled crowd, sharing their experiences and reflections. Morgan himself grew sentimental as the evening progressed. He reminisced about the mountain moonshine of his youth and playfully promised that after the war ended, he'd fly a bottle of it around the country. The home folks roared with approval. These barely adult men had become icons of American courage and resilience. Wherever the tour stopped, masses converged. They wanted to touch the aircraft itself, to peer into the bullet holes and examine the scarred aluminum where flak had ripped through. They wanted to meet the young men who had flown through hell. The tour served multiple objectives: training future combat crews by demonstrating real-world aircraft performance, allowing factory workers to witness what their labor had produced in actual service, and showing the American people the human cost and sacrifice the war demanded. Yet beneath the heroic surface, tensions simmered. For Jim Vereenes, the co-pilot, the tour marked the beginning of a shadow that would stretch across his entire life. The press consistently identified him merely as the Memphis Belle's co-pilot, a label that stuck like rust. Few acknowledged that he had commanded the Connecticut Yankee for 20 missions and had actually reached the 25-mission mark before Morgan himself. The narrative, however, required a single hero, and Morgan had been cast in that role. The nuances and individual accomplishments of other crew members became irrelevant in the face of such storytelling simplicity. Personal relationships fractured under the weight of sudden fame and wartime pressures. Morgan's romance with Margaret Polk, the young woman who had inspired the aircraft's name, deteriorated as the tour progressed. The breakup occurred during the latter stages of their journey across America. The tender connection that had first motivated the Memphis Belle's christening could not survive the transformation both had undergone. She watching her boyfriend become a national celebrity, he changed by the intensity of combat and the strange new experience of adulation. After 3 months of traveling and speaking across the nation, the Memphis Belle's active combat role concluded. On December 23, 1943, the aircraft was assigned to MacDill Field in Florida, where it transitioned into a training machine. Instructors and student crews would now use it to learn the fundamentals of B-17 operation and survival. The very aircraft that had endured German fighters and flak would spend the remainder of the war teaching others to endure the same. When victory in Europe finally arrived, the Memphis Belle's days as a training platform ended. The aircraft was transported to Altus Army Airfield in Oklahoma for storage. Across American air bases, vast fields filled with thousands of surplus bombers sat idle and awaiting their fate. The industrial machinery that had produced them with such urgency now had no further need for them. The Memphis Belle seemed destined for the scrapyard, cut to pieces, melted down, its components absorbed back into the national industrial cycle. Salvation arrived through an unexpected channel. Walter Chandler, the mayor of Memphis, intervened on the aircraft's behalf. He arranged for the city to purchase the B-17 for $350. That modest sum, less than the fuel cost of a single bombing mission, would prove the difference between preservation and oblivion. The aircraft was flown to Memphis in July 1946, where it sat in storage until the middle of 1949. Then it was positioned for public display near the city's fairgrounds at the National Guard Armory. For decades, the Memphis Belle remained outdoors, exposed to the relentless Tennessee weather and to vandals seeking to carve their names into history. The bomber that had defeated German fighters and flak faced a more insidious enemy: neglect and time. Paint peeled away in long strips, aluminum corroded and turned dull. Vandals etched their marks onto the fuselage. The aircraft that had survived the skies over Europe was slowly being destroyed by the elements and human indifference. A local businessman named Frank D'Onofrio recognized the tragedy unfolding and committed himself to saving the aircraft. His relentless advocacy convinced the city to donate land on Mud Island, where a proper pavilion could be constructed. Federal Express and Boeing each contributed $100,000 toward restoration efforts. The city added another $150,000. When Hugh Downs featured the Memphis Belle's preservation needs on television's 2020, the American people responded generously, donating the remaining funds needed to reach $576,000 total. On May 17, 1987, 44 years after the aircraft had flown its final combat mission, the Memphis Belle Pavilion opened to the public. Nearly 25,000 people gathered for the dedication. B-17s, 7 of them, the largest formation since the war ended, flew overhead in ceremonial salute and released thousands of rose petals over the pavilion. Margaret Polk and surviving crew members stood watching as the crowd erupted in thunderous cheers. It was a moment of vindication and honor, the famous bomber finally receiving the recognition and care it deserved. Margaret Polk, who had fought alongside so many others to preserve the aircraft and its legacy, passed away in 1990. Yet the outdoor pavilion on Mud Island, despite good intentions, could not provide the climate control necessary for long-term preservation. The aircraft continued to deteriorate. In 2004, the National Museum of the United States Air Force recognized what needed to happen and expressed their intention to bring the Memphis Belle back for comprehensive restoration and permanent display at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. The Memphis Belle arrived at the museum in mid-October 2005, transported in corroded pieces that had to be trucked across the country after the Memphis preservation effort exhausted its resources. What followed represented one of the most meticulous aircraft restorations in history. The project consumed 55,000 hours of painstaking, deliberate work. 55,000 hours of careful attention to detail by people who understood the profound historical significance of what they were doing. More than 100 volunteers and professionals labored over the 4-engine bomber, dedicating themselves to restoring it to its wartime condition. As technicians stripped decades of paint from the fuselage, an unexpected discovery emerged. Hundreds of names and personal messages appeared, scratched into the aluminum skin by countless visitors over the decades. Each scratch represented someone's desire to connect themselves to this famous aircraft, to leave their mark on something that had survived what they had merely witnessed. Restoration specialist Casey Simmons emphasized that the priority was getting everything right, fabricating even invisible components like a glycol heater that had been missing from inside the left wing. Nothing would be overlooked or approximated. The restoration team remained committed to complete authenticity, even in areas that visitors would never see. Many parts had long disappeared from production, requiring craftsmen to fabricate replacements by hand, sometimes working from only a fragment of an original component or without any blueprints at all. These skilled artisans weren't simply repairing an aging airplane, they were preserving living history, ensuring that future generations could witness and understand what the 8th Air Force had flown into combat. On March 14, 2018, the Memphis Belle moved into the museum's World War II gallery in a private ceremony. 2 months later, on May 17, 2018, it was officially unveiled to the public, exactly 75 years after completing its 25th mission. Robert K. Morgan Jr.'s voice trembled with emotion as he spoke about seeing the Memphis Belle completely restored for the first time in 50 years. His father had piloted the legendary B-17F through 25 perilous bombing runs and had devoted much of his remaining life to ensuring the aircraft's preservation. Morgan Jr. explained that his father had known before his death that the plane would come to the museum, that Memphis could not maintain it properly, and he had welcomed the knowledge that it would receive professional restoration and care at Wright-Patterson. The documentary that director William Wyler had created remained central to the Memphis Belle's enduring legacy. The 16mm color film contained no original sound. Narration and dialogue were added later in Hollywood studios. During the war bond drive, crew members watched this silent footage and added appropriate commentary. Their voices blended seamlessly with the film to create what seemed like authentic combat recordings. More than 15 hours of raw footage shot by Wyler and his cinematographers now reside in the National Archives, preserving visual documentation of what the crew experienced. In 2016, documentary filmmaker Eric Nelson discovered that 34 reels of original raw footage existed in the National Archives. He assembled a restoration team that meticulously replaced scratched and faded frames. Working from 90 hours of recovered film, Nelson created a new documentary titled The Cold Blue, which offered viewers an unmediated look at the crew's experiences and personalities during their wartime service and the Bond tour that followed. The crew members lived full lives after the war, though they carried experiences that set them forever apart from those who hadn't shared combat. Robert K. Morgan was hospitalized on April 22, 2004, with a fractured vertebra in his neck after falling outside Asheville Regional Airport while returning from an air show. He died at Mission Hospital on May 15, 2004, from complications arising from his injuries, including pneumonia. James Averyns passed away on March 3, 2003. Cecil H. Scott retired from Ford Motor Company after 30 years of service, dying in 1979. The remaining crew members returned to ordinary American lives, becoming fathers and grandfathers, working regular jobs, living in suburban communities across the nation. Yet the Memphis Belle's story transcended the experiences of a single crew or aircraft. 350,000 airmen served with the 8th Air Force based in England during the war. 26,000 of them were killed, a casualty rate of 7.42%. Compared to other branches of military service, the losses were staggering. The United States Marine Corps sustained a 3.29% casualty rate, the Army 2.25%, and the Navy 0.41%. The Air Corps bore the heaviest burden, paying the steepest price for victory. The loss of life among the 8th Air Force bomber crews exceeded the entire casualty count of the Marine Corps, despite the Marines having 250,000 more personnel in their ranks. When you look strictly at the mortality figures for 210,000 air crewmen, the numbers become staggering. The casualty rate stood at 12.38%, with 21,000 men spending the rest of the war confined to enemy prisoner of war camps. Those 250,000 air crew members who flew bombing runs in the 8th Air Force faced 58,000 total casualties. 18,000 were killed, another 6,500 were wounded, and 33,500 simply vanished, listed as missing in action. During the heaviest phase of combat against Germany, American bomber crew members faced odds that would horrify us today. 1 in 4. That was your chance of making it home alive. Think about what that means. 1 in 4, if you flipped a coin and needed it to land heads twice in a row. Those were your odds of survival if you were a bomber crewman in early 1943. The crew of the Memphis Belle had beaten those terrible odds not just once or twice, but more than 20 times over. There were missions where the losses became almost unbearable. In August 1943, one of the raids saw 30% of the attacking force fail to return. The mission to Schweinfurt in October that year resulted in 28% losses. After that catastrophic mission, the B-17 stopped flying deep into German territory without fighter protection. The strategy of sending unescorted bombers to strike precise targets in daylight had proven far too expensive in human lives. The solution came with the North American P-51 Mustang, but not the early version. The aircraft became truly formidable after receiving an American Allison engine replacement. The British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, supercharged by Packard, arrived in late 1942 and transformed the fighter. When the first P-51B Mustangs reached England in December 1943, they finally provided the long-range escort that bomber crews desperately needed. Had this aircraft been available just months earlier, thousands of airmen might have walked away from this war alive. For the entire bombing campaign, the 8th Air Force lost 4,082 aircraft out of 273,141 that attacked. That represented a loss rate of 1.5%. Yet even 1.5% becomes devastating mathematics when crews must fly multiple missions to complete their tour. By 1945, the 8th Air Force was operating lower in the sky and achieving remarkable accuracy. As much as 60% of bombs were falling within 1,000 feet of their intended targets. This was almost 4 times more accurate than those dark days of 1943. The bombing campaign evolved, adapted, and ultimately achieved its objectives. But the price paid was terrible beyond measure. Morgan reflected on his missions with grim clarity. Easy missions simply did not exist. There were no milk runs, no routine flights. Every single mission meant flying through flak so dense it seemed you could step out onto it. Every mission meant waves of German fighters attacking relentlessly. Every mission meant watching other bombers fall from the sky, watching parachutes bloom against the clouds, counting how many opened and knowing with absolute certainty that some of those men would not survive the fall. The cold at 25,000 feet became almost unbearable. Temperatures plummeted to 40, sometimes 50 degrees below zero. Frostbite became as common as hunger. The aircraft had no pressurization, oxygen masks frequently malfunctioned, and the air was so thin it felt like breathing through a straw. The gunners positioned themselves at open waist windows, fully exposed to the howling wind that could tear the breath from your lungs. The noise from 4 massive engines never stopped. The stress never ceased. Through it all, the Memphis Belle crew endured and survived. Morgan understood what kept them alive. Formation flying, incredibly tight formations where the wingtips came dangerously close to touching. This required every pilot to concentrate with absolute intensity and to trust the other pilots flying beside them completely. One moment of carelessness, 1 second of distraction, meant catastrophe and collision in the sky. The crew chief who maintained the Memphis Belle deserves recognition equal to any pilot or gunner. Joji Ambrosini, from Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, completely replaced 9 engines over the course of the campaign. He oversaw the replacement of both wings, both tail sections, both main landing gear assemblies, and countless other critical components. The Memphis Belle stayed flying because of his skill and dedication. While flight crews earned medals and received public attention, ground crews like Ambrosini made everything possible. They worked through bitter English winters, often outside in the cold and rain, performing seemingly impossible feats of maintenance and repair. The Memphis Belle survived through a combination of good fortune, but also through Morgan's exceptional piloting skills and the professionalism of every crew member. They functioned as a seamless unit where each man knew exactly what he needed to do and performed it flawlessly, even when experiencing extreme stress and danger. That teamwork, that absolute confidence in one another, separated those who survived from those who did not. After finishing their combat tour, some crew members made the extraordinary decision to keep fighting. Casablanca returned to Europe and eventually completed 60 combat missions total. John Quinlan attempted to rejoin Morgan for operations in the Pacific, but was instead assigned to the China-Burma-India theater, where he became a gunner ace by shooting down 3 enemy aircraft before his B-29 was shot down. These men, having survived what seemed impossible once, deliberately chose to face those odds again. Morgan himself commanded a second tour in the Pacific. He piloted a B-29 Superfortress called Dauntless Dottie. On November 24, 1944, his aircraft led the first B-29 raid against Tokyo itself. The Memphis Belle story represents something essential about ordinary Americans. These were not men born to heroic destinies. They were farm boys and factory workers, college students and traveling salesmen. Some volunteered, others were drafted. They trained and then found themselves in what would become the deadliest air war humanity had ever witnessed. They responded by rising to meet impossible challenges. These men never considered themselves heroes. After the war ended, when journalists and historians interviewed them, they consistently pushed praise aside. They talked about simply doing their jobs. They emphasized what their teammates had accomplished. They credited others. This humble perspective, this refusal to claim extraordinary status, defined their entire generation. They had done what the moment required, and that felt like enough. But we can see what they accomplished, even if they could not allow themselves to claim it. They flew into the face of death more than 20 times and came back alive. They helped demonstrate that precision bombing in daylight could succeed, even if the original plan needed significant revision. They offered inspiration to a nation that desperately needed it during the dark period of early 1943. They became embodiments of American resolve and bravery. The Memphis Belle now rests in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, meticulously restored to pristine condition. For the Air Force, this restored bomber carries symbolic weight as profound as the flag raising on Iwo Jima represents for the Marines, or the USS Arizona Memorial represents for the Navy. The aircraft sits with bomb bay doors open, propellers attached, nose gleaming in the museum light. Bomb mission markers and fighter kill symbols cover the fuselage. Every rivet, every panel, every gauge has been carefully returned to its original appearance. It looks precisely as it did on that May Day in 1943 when it returned from Le Havre for the final time. This is not a Hollywood telling of the story. This is not a sanitized narrative of American heroes easily vanquishing German villains. This is the actual story of teenagers who climbed into metal aircraft every few days and flew directly into the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses ever assembled. These were young men who understood the statistics. They knew their survival was statistically improbable. They flew anyway because the mission required it. The Memphis Belle's true significance extends beyond one crew defeating the odds. It represents what that accomplishment meant for everyone still engaged in the fighting. When losses were catastrophic in late 1942 and early 1943, when survival appeared impossible, the Memphis Belle crew kept flying and kept returning. They became living proof that it could be achieved. They represented hope for all the other crews still completing missions, still facing those dreadful odds. When they finished their tour and came home to America, they carried that hope with them. At every Bond rally, every factory floor, every training base on their publicity tour, they stood as proof that survival was achievable. They demonstrated that American air power could strike deep into Nazi Germany and return safely. They became propaganda in the most literal sense, yet propaganda grounded in absolute truth. The Memphis Belle serves as a memorial to all who participated in the strategic bombing offensive. This aircraft completed combat missions when the odds suggested it should have been destroyed. It carried 10 men through some of the most intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks in military history and brought them all back safely. The young men who flew this bomber never thought of themselves as heroes, yet they were. The restored and honored Memphis Belle ensures their story continues. When people walk through the Air Force Museum and encounter this aluminum aircraft, carefully restored to match its 1943 appearance, they see far more than a machine. They see courage embodied in metal. They see sacrifice. They see the immense cost of freedom. Visitors should consider that this single aircraft represents thousands of bombers that never came home. They should remember the tens of thousands of airmen who perished in the European skies. They should contemplate the bravery required to climb aboard day after day, understanding the mathematics, knowing statistically you probably would not survive, yet doing it because duty demanded it. The Memphis Belle's influence extends well beyond the Second World War itself. It shaped American thinking about air power, about strategic bombing, about the men willing to fly into danger. The aircraft became woven into American identity, a chapter in the story of the greatest generation. It inspired novels, movies, documentaries, and countless articles. It captured the American imagination in 1943 and continues to captivate people today. The Memphis Belle remains one of only a handful of B-17F models still existing. Most were dismantled once hostilities ended. Those that survived were often converted to different purposes or modified until they bore little resemblance to their original form. The Memphis Belle, through a blend of its historical significance, fortunate circumstances, and decades of dedicated preservation work, survived essentially intact. The restoration reveals to modern and future generations what these aircraft actually appeared as, helps them understand the enormous size and sophistication of the machines, allows them to appreciate the remarkable technology and engineering embedded within them. The 10 men who flew the Memphis Belle through to the end of their tour were among the fortunate. They survived. They returned home. They built lives, started families, pursued careers. But they carried their experiences with them always. They never stopped remembering their time flying over Europe, never stopped thinking about the friends who did not make it back, never forgot the sensation of flying through flak and fighter attacks. The fear never completely left them. The adrenaline surges remained fresh in their minds. The bone-deep exhaustion of combat never entirely faded. Ultimately, the Memphis Belle represents all crews, all aircraft, all missions flown during the strategic bombing campaign. It symbolizes what that campaign cost and accomplished in defeating Nazi Germany. The price was measured not only in destroyed aircraft and tons of bombs dropped, but in lives fundamentally transformed, in young men who aged years in months, in the families left behind grieving sons and brothers and fathers. The Memphis Belle stands bearing witness to all of this. Every visitor who pauses before this beautifully restored aircraft should take a moment to reflect. Consider what this machine represents: the courage of the men who flew it, the sacrifices they made, the unbreakable spirit of those who climbed into the flak-filled skies of World War II and through determination and luck returned home.